Moving along, I would like to introduce Dr. Kenneth Valpey, His Holiness Krishna Kshetra Swami, who will be speaking on The Map is Not the Territory, Mapping Hermeneutic Approaches to the Bhagavata Cosmology. Dr. Valpey was initiated by Srila Prabhupada in 1972 and served Srila Prabhupada's mission in Europe for a long time, ongoing time frame. He completed his doctorate in philosophy at the University of Oxford with a study of Vaishnav temple liturgical practices in theology, which was published by Routledge in 2006, and now is a research fellow of the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies, as well as the Oxford Center for Animal Ethics. To wit, there is a book, am I going to get the title of this right? Animal Ethics in, no? Cow Care in Traditional Hindu Animal Ethics. No, I'm not going to get it right. Never mind the traditions. There is traditional and modern takes on it. Despite not knowing the title, I assure you I have read the book. He presently co-directs with Dr. Gupta the Bhagavata Purana research project of the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies. And without further ado, let me give you this microphone.
Maybe you can put it on. Thank you. Let me get myself organized here. I was so happy to be reminded that theology is the queen of the sciences. I think that's giving me some encouragement. I have to say that Radhikaraman Prabhu and we came to Oxford at the same time, but there was one difference. I was 47 or 48 years old, and he was 17. We were doing the same course. Okay, I have to open this. First, I go here. First, I do this. Yes, I want to also thank the organizers. I was surprised. I was deeply surprised that I was invited to speak here. I thought, what am I doing here? And sure enough, I'm feeling some trepidation, like a rabbit amongst elephants. But I will try to say something that will be giving a different perspective on this topic of hermeneutics, specifically modern Western hermeneutical thought as something we might sort of feed into the whole discussion. I just have to share my screen. I guess like this, and then like this. How does that look?
Good.
Looks good? Okay, great. So the title of my talk, oh wait, let me get this over here. Yes, now the map is not the territory, mapping hermeneutic approaches to the Bhagavatam's cosmology. I was thinking of calling this just Hermeneutics 108, but this is maybe more to the point of what I want to say. I don't know if that can work. Oh, okay. Yes. So as I put in the abstract of my presentation, I quoted this passage from the 5th canto, which you're probably familiar with. And my question starts out with a very specific one: how to understand that this is understood, as Prabhupada says in the purport. So to remind you, we can just read through this. The mud on both banks of the river Jambu Nadi, being moistened by the flowing juice and then dried by the air and the sunshine, produces huge quantities of gold called Jambu Nada. The denizens of heaven use this gold for various kinds of ornaments. Therefore, all the inhabitants of the heavenly planets and their youthful wives are fully decorated with golden helmets, bangles, and belts, and thus they enjoy life. So in the purport, Prabhupada says, it is understood that in a higher planetary system in this material world, the mud on the banks of the Jambu Nadi mixes with jambu juice, reacts with the sunshine in the air, and automatically produces huge quantities of gold. So the chemists in the audience may be challenged to explain how that works. So map is not territory. This phrase comes from Alfred Korzybski, and if he has no other fame, he has from this statement. And it raises questions. If the map is not the territory, then what is the map? And how does it function in relation to the territory? We're talking about a text which is describing a place, apparently, when we're talking about cosmography. So yes, what is the relation between the Bhagavata's descriptions, written linguistic representations, and the actualities out there that the text describes? More specifically, what is the relation between the Bhagavata's descriptions and that which is described, especially in its cosmography? That relation has to do with processes of interpretation and understanding. I began to wonder whether different hermeneutical approaches, Vedic traditional as well as others, could be themselves mapped in relation to this question as a way to help think about relating Bhagavata cosmology with contemporary cosmology. So my concern here is with hermeneutics, and I want to keep in mind this particular description of Jambu Nada gold production as a case of strangeness that Srila Prabhupada says is understood to be produced in this particular way. Okay, this is now the Hermeneutics 108 part. Hermeneutics is the art of practice of interpretation. The hermeneutic tradition in the West, sometimes just called hermeneutics, is a tradition that gives great philosophical weight to an interpretative mode of understanding. And then some members of the famous names of this tradition include Friedrich Schleiermacher, Wilhelm Dilthey, Martin Heidegger, Hans-Georg Gadamer, and Paul Ricoeur. And I'll be giving attention to Hans-Georg Gadamer. Gadamer's idea, well, let's look at what I've put up here, which I took from some AI-generated paraphrasing, I confess. Gadamer's hermeneutics offers a philosophical framework that recognizes the complexity of interpretation and understanding. It invites us to engage in a dialogic and reflexive process. Reflexive means, who am I doing this? Thinking about one's own position, we would say adhikar. Acknowledging the role of our own biases and traditions while seeking to bridge the gap between our horizons and those of others. Gadamer's idea is that things that have otherness or unfamiliarity are of most value. They expand our consciousness. Sciences of understanding what is unfamiliar or incomprehensible are essential to this development. Hermeneutic circles, which we've heard about so nicely, and fusing horizons are principles by which actual growth happens in every event of understanding. So what I want to do is look briefly at three senses of hermeneutics that Gadamer uses in our context. So first, the hermeneutics of consent, then the hermeneutics of suspicion, and then integrative hermeneutics. At this point, I better ask when I should stop, because I don't want to go too long.
We did start a little bit late, so 10:30-ish.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Frantically. Okay, so I'm going to consider Bhagavata hermeneutics as hermeneutics of consent. And I'll start with a quote from a commentary to 5th Canto, chapter 16, verse 7, from Vijayadvaja, the 15th century Madhva Sampradaya commentator. He says, the words of Vyasa, an ocean of infinite wisdom, cannot be doubted. And according to him, details regarding the world, the earth's sheaths are the topic here, should be taken as per Bhagavata. Any other text, in case of contradiction, should be reconciled as required. So this sounds very much to me like hermeneutics of consent. He's consenting to what is said and saying, let's work it out if there are any contradictions. He says in the context of the description of the fruits falling from the jambu tree, which are referred to as being the size of elephants, he says the following: the size of elephant is meant to perceive the fullness and not actual dimension. Now, you may at this point want to breathe, okay, so it's actually not so big as an elephant. But hold on, he says, the actual size is mentioned in Vayu Purana as, quote, sages who directly and truly perceive entities, Rishidi, Tattvadarshidi, have told the fruit to be 861 aratnis. What's an aratni? This is an aratni. Multiply that by 861 and you have something like 4 football fields in length. Okay. Speaking of elephants, could it be the case that in some sense the map is the territory when it comes to sacred texts? The reader or auditor is meant to enter into the text, to abide there in the cultivation of realization. Well, we can also be thinking about the multiplicity of interpretation. Sanatana Goswami is, in this case, kind of a favorite of mine in the 10th Canto commentaries. He always has a whole bag full of different options for taking different words and phrases. And then famously for us, Srila Bhaktivedanta Thakur with his allegorical interpretations of Krishna's childhood demon-killing leelas. He never denies the literal meaning. That has to be also mentioned. Briefly now, in this context, we can mention that Richard Thompson acknowledges in his book, Mysteries of the Sacred Universe, There are multiple versions and variations of cosmology, cosmography, in the various Puranas. The Mahabharata, which, by the way, has a much less developed cosmology or cosmography, and in Jain and Buddhist texts. Is there, this is a silly question to put in this form, is there a system of hermeneutics within the Vedic tradition? Indeed, there is. So traditional Shastric hermeneutics to the rescue. Tatu Samanvayat from the Vedanta Sutra, Lord Krishna is the conclusion because of the totality of all scriptural statements. And this is, in this context, drawn from the Shastra Advisory Council of ISKCON's GVC work on hermeneutics, which has put together a book of 284 pages. So one of the 24 principles discussed there, along with 40 tools for doing hermeneutics, plus 6 qualities for adhikar, is all elaborated. I'm taking one of these, number 6 of the principles. Scriptures are consistent and coherent, enabling meaningful dialogue between part and whole. And here we go with the hermeneutic circle with a bit of graphics. You have a text, what do you do with it? You interpret it. Prabhupada said, don't interpret. Well, except that it depends what you mean by interpret. And this is an ongoing process. This is, I think, what this graphic nicely shows. And it's not leading to a static once and forever understanding. This could be considered a component, we may say, of what can be called religious reading, such as the medieval Christian Lectio Divina process. And what we will find with the Bhagavatam is not something surprising. The Bhagavatam's cosmology is embedded in a worldview centered on divinity, and in turn, divinity is thoroughly embedded in the Bhagavata's cosmology. The hermeneutics of consent that seems to constitute Bhagavat hermeneutic practice prioritizes, I would suggest, bhakti at every turn, locating it at the center of the hermeneutic circle. Arguably, I would also suggest dharma is closely bound with bhakti in the central hermeneutical location. Okay, but how does this help us understand, in quotation marks perhaps, jambu fruit turning into gold? Well, stay tuned. But first we're going to move on to the hermeneutics of suspicion. And this is not going to be in the context of the Bhagavatam, but in the context of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. Why is that? Because in the third part of the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali refers to a practice called samyama, and he describes there that by specific practices of samyama, there come specific results or siddhis. In the Sutra 326, Bhuvana Jnanam Surye Samyamat, by performing samyama on the sun arises knowledge of the different realms in the universe. By samyama on the moon, there is knowledge of the solar systems. By samyama on the pole star comes knowledge of the movement of the stars. So the Yoga Sutra commentaries elaborate on details of this universe, and it's just interesting to note that in their commentaries, they refer to the descriptions in the Puranas. But here, what's being claimed is a form of Vaidusha Pratyaksha, direct experience by these, in this case, yogi sages, we may say. Well, okay, if map is not territory, what can be said about the claims of yogic powers and knowledge gained by certain samyama meditation practices? Now I sort of step to the side to refer to the Buddhist science dialogue discussed by Donald Lopez in his book, Scientific Buddha. He says that this Buddhist science dialogue that's going on today is mainly on the subject of meditation. And he says, if there is to be a dialogue between Buddhism and science, if there is to be, it will come in the form of translation, an activity central to the spread of the Dharma over the centuries and across the realms. Here, the translation will not be the translation of the 4 levels of the formless realm into levels of blood pressure, but the more challenging translation of doctrine into meditative states and meditative states into scientific data. Well, we can leave that to the Buddhists, but I thought it will be interesting to point this out. All right, a little interlude, Hermeneutics of Suspicion 107. The expression comes from Paul Ricoeur's coinage. It is his coinage that he refers to in his book, Freud and Philosophy. He names 3 masters of suspicion. You guessed it, Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, and Friedrich Nietzsche. And I would add to this Jacques Derrida, who is famous for his deconstruction of texts. The straightforward meaning of text is regarded as deceptive or self-deceptive. Explicit texts hide deeper meanings and implications, especially in regard to establishing and maintaining power over and oppression of others. Perhaps a bit more mildly put, texts always simultaneously reveal and conceal. From the Vedic tradition, one might want to think about riddles which are found in texts such as the Rig Veda, which are used in contests. They're called Brahmodya contests. Closer to home, the Bhagavata, we have the statement from Krishna to Uddhava. He says, the Vedas divided into 3 divisions ultimately reveal the living entity as pure spirit soul. The Vedic seers and mantras, however, deal in esoteric terms, and I also am pleased by such confidential descriptions. So that's hermeneutics in half of a nutshell. So what are some examples of hermeneutics of suspicion? I said hermeneutic, I meant hermeneutics of suspicion in a nutshell. What are some examples of what that could look like with regard to these yoga siddhis? Well, one would be the idea that, where does this idea come from in the Yoga Sutras? Perhaps it's seeped in from the vast Indian literary tradition and sort of came out through the Yoga Sutras as a kind of natural theology. Maybe. Or one scholar has suggested some powers are real. Just see you can see in the changes in bodily functions of one who is meditating. There's been tons of experiments on that. But other powers are mythical, symbolic, or psychical in nature. And so this is all about the demythologizing as transfiguration of human capacities and abilities. The supposed powers are expressions of or transpositions of real experiences. Further, yogic powers may be a hook to entice adherents, part of a cynical marketing scheme for yoga. Yoga offers the promise of power to the powerless. And further to that psychological explanation, yoga powers are an expression of infantile powerlessness, overcoming repressed childhood experiences of powerlessness. Yes. And of course, there are sociological and economic explanations and on. We can see there's a sharp, even radical difference between the hermeneutics of consent and the hermeneutics of suspicion. And we can see the thrust of Prabhupada's teachings as arguing for the hermeneutics of consent with respect to the Bhagavatam, and thereby challenging the hermeneutics of suspicion with respect to Vedic literature. This challenge need not, however, be a complete rejection of it, insofar as it preserves and nurtures the impulse to enter ever deeper into a text's meaning, rather than its supposed purpose of rejecting the text altogether. We can also take it positively as a caution expressed by the motto, "The map is not the territory." As for what suspicious hermeneutics might bring to understanding giant jambu fruits, transforming into gold minimally, we could say it could lead one to regard the description as somehow symbolic. More strongly, it could lead one to suspect that whoever reported this account must have been under the influence of psychedelics, perhaps soma rasa. Now I'm going to move to a third sort of hermeneutics, integrative hermeneutics. And again, this comes from Gadamer. And as an example of integrative hermeneutics, I think we can take Richard Thompson's explorations in the mysteries of the sacred universe as a practice of this. So, for example, his mapping the Bhagavata's 5th canto descriptions onto contemporary geographic and cosmographic accounts, his notion of context-sensitive models, and this is where he speaks of this in the Bhagavatam. The context-sensitive approach was rendered particularly appropriate by the conviction that reality and the ultimate issue is avak manasam, or beyond the reach of the mundane mind or words. This implies that a literal one-to-one model of reality is unattainable. And so one may as well pack as much meaning as possible into a necessarily incomplete description of the universe. I can't see there. Okay, I have to move this out of the way now. Go back. Read my thing. Thus, Richard Thompson is affirming that map is not territory, applies to the Bhagavatam's cosmographic descriptions because they are necessarily incomplete. What the relationship is between map and territory is complex and made more meaningful for us by showing connections to modern cosmographic understandings. Also, yes, he acknowledges figurative language and codes. He puts quotation marks around the words islands and oceans. So that's an indicator of use of figurative language. And another quote from him, he says, the geography of Bhumandala encodes a combination of astronomical and geographical maps, which is both rational and scientific. It appears that the elements of Bhumandala geography have either been introduced or adapted to convey a number of meaningful messages, some of which may still remain obscure, perhaps as riddles, I would add. And now I have to move this back up here. Excuse me. So we have these three types of modalities of hermeneutics, and we might be tempted to think of them in Hegelian terms: thesis, antithesis, synthesis. But this might be too much constraining our purpose of understanding what hermeneutics is all about. What Gadamer seems to be saying is about going beyond the limits of understanding that modern natural sciences can offer. He's writing in the context of grounding Geisteswissenschaft, humanities, we say, or the human sciences outside the natural sciences. Can we go further in our hermeneutic pursuit of truth? If time allows. Yes, I think time allows shortly. He's already getting nervous. Extending the integrative hermeneutics, I want to suggest we take some thought from Jessica Fraser, who is at the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies and also a lecturer in theology at Trinity College, Oxford. And what did she write her doctoral dissertation on? Gadamer and Rupa Goswami. Rather than dialogue between two supposedly disparate worldviews, what may be called for is triangulation of multiple voices, what she calls choral hermeneutics. And what does she mean by that? She says, the old model of hermeneutics assumed that I reached out of my cultural assumptions to engage in dialogue and comprehend your views, all within a dialogical relation to my tradition that meant I would necessarily transform my own cultural inheritance, fusing our horizons according to the phrase made famous by Gadamer's work, truth, and method. But this model envisions cultural encounter as the occasional meeting between two cultures, reaching across a border. Continuing, what happens when not two, but multiple cultures become part of a conversation so that the dialogue develops into a chorus? In its global form, hermeneutics might be said to take a turn into a space of greater multiplicity, recognizing the way in which our ideas are formed, not through a fusion of own and other cultures, but as a triangulation of many different cultural frameworks that exist within one's own culture, in the other culture, and alongside both in alternative ways of thinking. Ooh, okay. Here's how I want to sort of translate that. What if we would do our Bhagavata Purana hermeneutics with a conscious awareness of these four sorts of tradition? Of course, we have the Vedic corpus, which the Bhagavatam claims or identifies itself as being the fruit of. Does that mean we forget the Veda? Jiva Goswami sometimes seems to say, just don't worry about it. And Bhaktivedanta Thakur says you can burn it all and nothing is lost. Yeah, that's a tough one for me. We have the commentarial tradition. We have actually commentarial traditions, plural. And I want to suggest, hey, what about us, the readers, who are reading and have our backgrounds? And what about all those other traditions out there in which we find ourselves? And these are just, minimal expressions. Each of these could be expanded, all of these different, types of traditions and sub-traditions and sub-sub-traditions. We're swimming in many hermeneutic universes, perhaps. So choral hermeneutics, one could object. Wouldn't it end up just as a cacophony? I want to say no, not if we begin with the hermeneutics of consent, identifying bhakti and dharma as two principles around which the hermeneutic circle rotates. Then from there, the practice of dialogical interpretation works outward, inclusive of all that is encountered in the hermeneutic universe. And so we keep Krishna in the center. And through this process, we can do a kind of choral hermeneutics, which will enrich everyone involved. Conclusions, let's just say the map is not the territory. And so we have to do hermeneutics. I won't pace you through all of this, but I'll remind you of Srila Prabhupada's question, or his comment. It is understood, he said, that in a higher planetary system in this material world, the mud on the banks of the Jambu Nadi mixes with Jambu juice, reacts with the sunshine in the air, and automatically produces huge quantities of gold. And but that's not the whole purport. Prabhupada uses the word understand again in this purport. He says, after talking about gold and how in this world people are wearing plastic instead of gold and so on, then he describes our situation, manda sumanda matayo, manda bhagyo padrita, and then he says, in other words, they, that's us, are extremely bad and slow to understand the opulences of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. We're slow. But what I want to say about I'm haunted by Jambu juice becoming gold. And it seems to me that at least on some level, what the Bhagavatam is saying is that where there is piety, where there is dharma, there is gold, the wealth of Krishna prema. And the demigods enjoy that. So I think I will stop there and say thank you very much.